Okay, today's Q&A. So the floor is open, yeah.
So my question is, what is God's role in the state of Israel from its foundation until today? Because I noticed that there are many mixed opinions between like the religious Jews and secular Jews and Zionists and
It's a very tricky question, and it's a very, very broad question. You started one way, but then I heard you move to, are you asking what role the citizens allow God to play in terms of the different groups of citizens? Or are you talking about God's providence running the world?
my question comes from, like, on the one hand, there's a lot of ever since like Israel's foundation, everyone, the state of Israel's foundation, there's been like criticism because like for example, like either because like the Zionists made a mistake because like they came when the base man Hamikdash wasn't around, or that they created a secular state that's not really tied to Judaism on the one hand, but on the other hand, like we've seen many miracles, and we've seen like the state of Israel becoming gradually more religious. So I'm just curious what like God's providence.
Okay, let me start by quoting a verse from the book of Esther, when Mordechai goes wailing through the streets because he knows of Haman's decree and nobody else knows. And then he informs people, and the Jewish people pick it up. And Esther hears that there's some kind of crisis, but she has no details. She sends her trusted servant to Mordechai, and she says to him, find out, Mazeh ve'al mazeh. Two questions. What is this? And roughly, what is it for? What's its purpose? What are the underlying features that are driving this crisis? Rabbi Meisman, who's taught me a very great deal, says that there you're talking about two different levels of understanding. One is you're facing danger, find out who your enemies are, what their powers are, what their motivations are, who might be your allies, what weaknesses do your enemies have, what kind of strategies can you concoct to be able to respond to the danger. That's on the ground. That's visible, that's understandable by human beings. Of course, you can make mistakes, but it's something which people do all the time. That's mazeh. The al mazeh would mean, what does the Creator want from this? Because it didn't happen by accident. So if these forces are arrayed against us, the Creator wants some kind of reaction. And neither question alone is enough. Of course, if you know the physical, psychological, sociological, military, economic situation well, and you don't know what divine providence wants, then you're missing the underlying purpose of the whole thing. But even if you know what the divine providence wants, often the divine providence wants a reaction to the circumstances that you're in. And if you don't know the circumstances that you're in, you don't know where to apply the divine providence. So she asked for an answer to both questions. Now, I'm not one of the people who can tell you what the Creator wants from the situation. So however, I can see visibly certain aspects of the way in which Kodesh Baruch Hu was interacting with the situation, and I think that they are symptoms. And then we could talk a little bit about people's reaction to the matter. People's reaction will certainly be, for me, an incomplete presentation because I haven't studied all of it, and I didn't look consciously through all of it, which would start, let's say, in the late 1800s. Well, I can pick out little slivers, and if you really want to understand this, you'd have to ask other people as well and read some of the literature that's available on the subject. The one thing that strikes me, this has been on my mind for more than 40 years, Israel as a state is surrounded by Arab states. From the beginning of the Jewish settlement here, certainly from the founding of the state, all those states, those Arab states, are divided among themselves. They're divided politically, they're divided economically, Some have oil and some don't, which is a big difference. And they're divided religiously between Sunni and Shiite types of Islam and branches of Islam. So they have various things that divide them. But there's one thing they all agree on. There shouldn't be a state of Israel. That they all pledge allegiance to. And that being the case, it is really quite shocking, I think, that since 1948, they couldn't get together and say, okay, you're Sunni and we're Shiite, but we'll all rejoice when the state of Israel is gone, right? So let's get together and do this. You have oil, we don't. We all want to get rid of Israel, don't we? Let's get together and do this. And they haven't been able to do it. I think that's a symptom of divine providence, which divides them, makes it impossible for them to agree on a project which really is in all of their best interests, so they think. And I see that as a way in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu manipulates the geopolitical situation so as to be able to protect the state of Israel against something which would require an even bigger miracle to save it from that kind of danger. Yes, a state that pledges allegiance to a secular, atheistic vision for the Jewish people is not what is promised in the prophets, though there are sources, like in the Maharal, who talk about a fruit growing with a husk, and when you come to eat the fruit, you throw away the husk. You just eat the meat of the fruit from the inside. And there is such a concept that the founding of the redemption will have also a husk, and it will have an inner part, and maybe the foundation, the outer part will have to be discarded. And that wouldn't be so different from what we are observing. Yes, the state as a whole has been evolving in the direction of more and more observance. It has been remarked that in the present government, half of the members of parliament who are part of the ruling government keep the Sabbath. Of the 60, 30 are Sabbath observant. That's never happened before. Nothing remotely resembling it has ever happened before. It is true that the state does support a great deal of Torah study and Torah institutions. Yes, for many unwillingly, and leftists are dragged kicking, screaming, and yelling and cursing into the corner when they have to do this. But as a matter of fact, the bottom line is that that it has been there. Now, it's inconsistent, and when government policies change, it changes. But it's certainly better than it was at the time of the founding. It's certainly better than nothing. There is a famous story, true or false, but it certainly expresses the spirit of the times. When the state was founded and they tried to unify the various different political factions, including the religious factions, into one agreement, Ben Gurion, who was the leader at the time, made an agreement with what was then Agudas Yisrael, that yeshiva students wouldn't go into the army. Sometime after he was challenged, you gave away a whole population. How could you do that? And he said, you're making a mistake. In 20 years, there won't be any yeshivas. Judaism is dead. Socialism is taking over the world. Religion is gone. Forget it. It was a joke. I gave it to them, so it's not to have their opposition. But we didn't lose anything. Didn't work out that way. I saw an estimate that in his day there were 400 yeshiva students, and now there are, I don't know, 100,000. So it didn't work out that way. But that was their idea. That was their attitude. Religion is a passing phase with more education. This is part of the Enlightenment of going over 200 years. With the Enlightenment and better education and the progress of science and international cooperation, there won't be any need for these superstitions and rituals and so forth and so on. We'll all graduate into a modern, tolerant, educated, sophisticated, and moral international culture. Didn't exactly work out that way. And I think the deep picture of what's going on here consistently is a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people. How shall the Jewish people define itself? This is traced back to the early moments of Zionism. There were two major secular movements in Zionism, the Herzl School and the Echad Ha'am School. The Herzl School, there's some debate about what his diaries reveal, but in practice, the framework was totally secular. Everybody's heard that he considered Uganda, but what they don't know is that when he wrote in his book, he considered Argentina. He has a whole section called Argentina or Palestine, which would be preferable. And revival of the Hebrew language was of no interest to him whatsoever. Speak Hebrew, speak English, speak German, speak Esperanto, which was the intellectuals offering for it to become an international language. It made absolutely no difference to him. Whether there be any Jewish culture there or no Jewish culture there, so no interest to him. And Echad Ha'am wanted a strong Jewish identity based on the classical Jewish experience, though he wasn't religious, but he understood that there should be a Jewish identity. So this struggle has been going on for a long time. I will just add an observation of mine, I'm not alone in this. In 1967, I was here a week after the Six-Day War. Previous summer, we had bought tickets, my wife and I, to be here in the summer of 1967. We didn't anticipate we were going to the greatest wars in the whole 20th century. We were here for like 10 weeks after the war. The Six-Day War is legendary. You can look it up. The spectacular victories and so forth and so on. Everyone was stunned. We're told that the powers that be dug 10,000 graves because those are the casualties that they expected. It was a tragic 750 about killed in the war. No one expected the last 6 days. It was a spectacular victory, spectacular, on all fronts. 6 years later, 1973, the state of Israel was caught by surprise, the Yom Kippur War, and enemies advanced on all fronts. There was a line of sophisticated artillery at the Suez Canal called the Bar-Lev Line, and just like the Maginot Line in France, which they said the Nazis will never be able to conquer, so they went round behind, didn't bother. Here, the Egyptian soldiers overran the Bar-Lev Line, the invincible Bar-Lev Line, and the Syrians took back the whole of the Golan. We had to fight to get it back again, but they were on the way into the land of Israel. We were losing on all fronts. I ask yourself, how could that happen? In 6 years? Did somehow in 6 years they get great new arms and were up to a par in their military equipment? Did they concoct new strategies? Did they retrain their soldiers? Did they change their cultures? No, they didn't do any of that. So you look at a spectacular success and a spectacular failure 6 years apart. You ought to think, hey, maybe something else is going on here, you know? Maybe it really isn't our strategy and our arms and our esprit de corps, as our friends the French would say, our spirit in arms. No, maybe something else is going on. Maybe there's another power that's really behind what's happening. That lesson wasn't learned. It was not expressed widely, and the lesson wasn't learned. The lesson wasn't learned. So 50 years later, that was Yom Kippur, and this was Simchas Torah. Week and a half apart. And you had another spectacular failure. Spectacular. With the greatest psychologists and the greatest anthropologists and the greatest sociologists and the greatest spy infiltration network and the greatest technological spy sources available and secret strategies and forces lined along the border, everything else. Spectacular failure. So I said, hello? Sounds like there's a message here. The overconfidence that they had. And they admit it now. They admit they were overconfident. And they admit that they missed the signs. I just saw now, they just discovered a film of an attack helicopter which flew over a line of trucks coming from Gaza and didn't shoot. Just didn't shoot. It had missiles. Didn't shoot. Just flew over and flew away. The number of, one of the commanders was in Eilat and on vacation. And of course, shall we wake him up or shall we not wake him up? And they didn't wake him up. So, commander wasn't there. I mean, a high commander, not a commander of a battalion. The number, so now, okay, so there is a general understanding there was a failure. But where does the failure come from? What's its source? What needs to be addressed? First of all, how about a reckoning of character failure? What elements of character? Overconfidence. Where does overconfidence come from? Is it that you've had 16 years of continuous success and you generalize it too strongly? Not really. There were failures in the 16 years also. So where does it come from? And is there anything else in Jewish cultural background which might have led to a better character, which would have perhaps protected against this terrible disaster, forewarned it? How about self-doubt? How about, sometimes I ask students who are very sure they know everything and they're always right. And well, when's the last time you discovered that something you believed was wrong? Some of them can't remember that ever happening. Oh, so you're 19 and it's over. You have nothing less to learn. Everything you know is perfect. That's not healthy. That's not healthy. I change my mind at least 3 times a day, and sometimes more. And I'm a little older than 19. So where is the self-searching of the failures in character that led to this kind of disaster? And where would you find in the heritage of Jewish experience, I'm using words which even a non-religious person could identify with, Jewish history, Jewish experience, Jewish values, which might have led to a better outcome? I don't hear that exploration going on at all. I don't hear anybody raising those questions. I think we're in danger of missing the message again. I know that Rabbi Dovid Grossman and someone else, whose name doesn't occur to me, before October 7th, said that we're running a terrible danger because of the nature of our disagreements. Disagreements are as old as Moses. There were people who disagreed with him also. Nothing unhealthy in disagreements. Indeed, the Maharal says, why do we have a Sanhedrin of 71? I don't believe in the whole of human culture you have a Supreme Court of 71 members. Okay, it also functioned as a legislature, and so, but 71 members, a lot of people. Says the Maharal, people are different. Each person's grasp is partial. You need to have the cross-fertilization of ideas coming from different perspectives to get as general and as widely based a grasp of the situation as possible. Well, our tradition says that just as people's, we would say the DNA isn't the same, and even if the DNA is the same, even your identical twins, notice that your fingerprints aren't the same. So DNA doesn't determine everything. It's the way the DNA interacts with the uterine environment also that has an effect. And that isn't identical, because otherwise identical twins would have identical fingerprints, and they don't. DNA doesn't control everything. The environment produces tremendous variations in human beings. We should expect that. And then, having expected it, we should try to treat people with at least the respect so we can benefit from their point of view, which is different from ours. We should welcome the differences of point of view instead of trying to shut them up. Now, we used to say one of the great blessings of Israel is that it's 20 years behind the USA, because the USA was on a downward trajectory, and at least Israel hadn't gone down that far. But it's learning. It's learning. There's some people, some groups, whose theme song is, you aren't legitimate. And since you aren't legitimate, I don't have to listen to you. Nothing you say counts. You couldn't possibly know something I don't know. Everything you say is evil. And therefore, anything's justified. We can burn your car. We can shut down your institutions over the so on, because anything you say, nothing you say is worth considering. That was going on even before October 7th, and some pointed out that that's not supposed to be the way in which the Jewish people functions. I'm not saying it's unique to this period in history. We had similar things in the past. I can't measure the extent, But it's dangerous. It's dangerous. Unity is a great merit in the eyes of divine providence. I'll end with one application of that, and then I'll stop and have time for other questions. In the book of Genesis, you have two great human rebellions. You have the one that ended in the flood, and the one that ended in the dispersal, Tower of Babel. Now, the crimes recorded in the tradition of the generation of the flood were murder and theft and sexual immorality and idol worship and so forth and so on, and it ended up in disaster, leaving alive only 8 people. The crime that's associated in the oral tradition with the generation of the dispersal is organized, unified, direct rebellion against God. Rebellion. You could think that the latter is worse than the former. Okay, when a person commits murder, they're almost always because he's in a frenzy of anger. Something happened that he can't say. Yes, he should control his anger. I'm not excusing anything. But it isn't thought out. It isn't organized. It isn't deliberate. You don't spend months and years organizing your resources to be able to effect that kind of a crime. Yet, the reaction to the flood was death, and the reaction to this to the Tower of Babel was dispersion over the face of the earth. Does the crime really fit the punishment really fit the crime? So some of our sources say the one thing that in the generation of dispersal they had in their favor was they were unified. Now you'll say, yeah, but they were unified to do evil. I mean, doesn't that make it worse? No, it doesn't make it worse. No, it doesn't. It doesn't make it worse. Being unified is a valuable human trait. So much so that Kodesh Baruch Hu said, I want them to survive. I will disunify them so that unity will have to be purchased, constructed, organized from their side. But since unity was their spirit, it's something which I want to leave for them. So when the Jewish people are unified, it makes a big difference in how divine providence approaches them. And when the Jewish people are bitterly disunified and bitterly dismissive of one another's basic worth, then we put ourselves in danger. That's something which they said before October 7th, and I think October 7th showed it grandly. Now, for those of us who've been here, right after October 7th, there was a period of months where you felt people shoulder to shoulder. You really did feel people overlooking those kinds of differences and trying to volunteer to help one another. But it's almost 2 years now. And that spirit has not remained, certainly not to the extent that it was then. I think that's something that we have to think about with great seriousness. That's 3% of the picture. Okay, other questions? Yeah.
How do we distinguish from what is divine and faultless and what is not? And what is the process that we go through to declare it as such? Specifically, texts and ideas that emerged after the stopping of prophecy, the finishing of prophecy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you've said the right word. What is divine is what is the result of prophecy. Prophecy is a direct communication from the Creator.
What about the Mishnah?
No, the Mishnah is a human formulation of laws. Many of the laws were communicated to Moses orally and passed down orally, but you don't receive laws, you receive words. And in many cases, the words are not the words that he received. They're not the words that even the words that he said. In fact, Rav Dessler has a very interesting remark that there are laws in the Talmud where they trace it back to an oral tradition going to Moses. And sometimes it means that the words that we have are the words that Moses told us. And sometimes it doesn't mean that. We know the practice and we know how it's done, but the actual words that he communicated have been lost. And Rav Dessler says that if you have the words, then it's a law. But if you don't have the words, then it's, in his words, a nohag. And nohag means something that we are accustomed to do. It isn't even a minhag, where minhag comes under the rubric of minhag Yisrael Kedin, can take on the aspect of a kind of legality. It's just something that's done. And if that's the case, then if reasons arise to perhaps change the way it's done, they have to be taken seriously. So people ask, how could there be two different versions of tefillin? The way in which the parchments are arranged in the tefillin, the order is different between the two that we use contemporarily. How could that possibly be? Moses commanded tefillin. The first generations had tefillin. Everybody, when they saw tefillin, they had tefillin made. Must have been that they saw the ones that were in previous generations. How could there possibly arise a difference in the type of arrangement of the parshos and the tefillin? And he says because, although it's a halacha lo Sinai, a law that comes from Moses orally, the formulation of it was lost. Since the formulation of it was lost, it was open for people to use whatever other aspects of the tradition they are in charge of, that in scholarly terms they have a right to use to make their decisions. And a dispute arose as to what would be the appropriate order given the other aspects of the tradition. Now, by our losing those words, which from my point of view isn't an accident, it's a signal that God is telling you, I now want this to be controversial. It wasn't controversial before, but I now want it to be controversial. I want you to use your minds and use the rest of the tradition to try to figure out exactly how it should be done. And we responded by doing that. So what's perfect and divine is something which is a direct result of prophecy. And anything else is going to be human, and since it's going to be human, it's going to... A tricky case is where God inspires the thought, but doesn't dictate the words. But then, of course, he inspires the thought in special people. You know, he doesn't pick a 6-year-old and have him babble, and somebody takes dictation and finds out that it's the greatest wisdom in the world. So, again, we would say, yes, there's a human component, but it's a very exalted human component. And that being the case, we're not going to take it trivially. You know, I mean, people say, who says you should interpret the text that way? You know, Rashi says, but I think differently. You would never say that about Einstein, would you? Einstein said, curved space-time? No, that's silly. Time can't be curved. Einstein must be wrong. You'd never say that. No, because that's Einstein. I wouldn't challenge Einstein like that. I'd look very foolish if I challenged Einstein like that. Yes, you would. That's right. You would definitely look foolish. Well, if you had any picture of Rashi's scholarly output, you should feel the same way about Rashi. And certainly, if you're talking about King David, who was inspired by God, and he wrote Psalms and other things, that's what King David said, but we know better. No, you don't know better, actually. Matter of fact, you're not worthy of standing next to his toenails. So, that being the case, even if it isn't divine, it doesn't mean that it's open to every Tom, Dick, and Harry to say, I see things differently. So, I mean, your question could carry a wrong implication. There's the divine and there's the everyday stuff. That's not a good way to describe it. Okay, that's a start now. Yeah, what else is on people's minds?
Continuing on the vein of the state of Israel, divine providence, how do you think the state of Israel should deal with the sort of current but also future consequences of a growing segment of the population, namely Haredi people because of the birth rate, who have a generally much lower participation in the state project, in the economy and labor, whose value system seems to be, and not necessarily antithetical, but to a certain degree hostile to the current state of Israel.
That's a question which people will answer from different perspectives. Let me give you an analogy which you could think about. Let's say you have a certain rate of illness in a country, and you'd like to help the people who are ill. You think, well, let's see, how many doctors do we have? And how many companies do we have that are making medicines? Okay, maybe we should allocate more money to create more doctors and create more medicines. Probably that's a good idea. What about George, who's writing a medical textbook? He's not going to cure anybody ever. He's never going to see a single patient. So he's useless. Why? We want to cure people. We get people to cure people. Well, not exactly, because if he writes a good textbook and then doctors read that textbook and they'll be better doctors, then you'll get better medicine in the future, right? And what about somebody who's lobbying the legislature to give more money to people to write medical textbooks? He's never going to cure anybody. He's never going to see a patient. But because of him, there'll be more textbooks. Because of more textbooks, there'll be better doctors. Because of better doctors, they'll have better medicine. So people are playing direct and indirect roles in order to get the outcome that you want. Netanyahu, 30 years ago, wrote a book on the subject, and he preached it. He said, you want to have a strong army, you must have a strong economy, because you have to buy the things that an army needs. So he pushed high-tech to create the economic basis of being able to build a strong army. But those guys are making lasers. They don't carry guns and shoot at the enemy. Yeah, but without their lasers, you won't have guns. So the religious attitude is, if you don't have a religious identity in the state, your guns won't fire, and your economy will go down, and your criminal population will grow, and so forth and so on. All of it's supported by your Jewish identity and the Jewish practices that you're doing, which are feeding into all those projects that you want to see the state succeed at. And without that, you're not going to have them. And to complain about it is like saying, you're lobbying the government, you're just a paid lobbyist, you're just a paid politician, you're not doing anything. When really, because of him, there'll be more textbooks, because more textbooks, there'll be better doctors, there'll be better. It's just 4 steps down the line where the effect is going to be seen. So they're going to say, it's not that they're not participating, and it's not that they're antithetical. Without them, you won't have anything. Without them, you won't have anything. So you better not turn your back on them. This idea that they're not participating, that depends upon your point of view. If you have a secular point of view, then you don't see them as participating. If you have a religious point of view, then you say they're participating as much or more than all the others because they're all downstream from what they're doing. So it depends upon which way you look at it. If you're a secularist, you'll look at them one way and you do everything you can to weaken them and to destroy them and to get them to emigrate and get rid of them. Just now, I saw a census figure. The majority of school children in the kindergarten age come from the religious sector. Majority in the whole country. And the publication, the reporter said, there are lessons there to be learned. Think about what the country is going to be like 20 years from now. And people are gasping in disbelief and horror. And that's one of the reasons why 20 years ago, something like 500,000 Russians came to Israel, because none of them were religious. And this is a way of offsetting the natural growth of the religious sectors so that the country won't lose its secular character. Well, there aren't 500,000 Russian Jews waiting to come now. So that's not going to happen again. And indeed, the birth rate in the secular population is extremely low, as it is all over the world, by the way. All over the world. And it's going to change the character of the country. So I can just tell you that from the secular point of view, it has one meaning. From a religious point of view, it has a different meaning. And I guess, like when you study Talmud and you have 2 different interpretations running in your head the whole time, and you keep them both in your head, you look at the text and say, well, he sees it this way, he sees it this way. You have to have a stereoscopic mind where you keep these 2 pictures in mind and see that how each one looks at the circumstances. Yeah.
So if you could maybe address aliyah and people coming from, you just talked about 500,000 Russians. We've got 5 or 6 million Jews in America, and the country's going through extreme times. New York may get this crazy, fascist, jihadist mayor, and I'm looking at real estate here, and the average person, they can't buy a new Shalim or Tel Aviv. They've got these projects going on out the outside, they're expensive. And if 1 million Jews came from America, how could they, with all the traffic, how could they actually absorb all this coming in here? So people are talking about aliyah and coming in, but the reality is, how would it actually, the next 1 to 3 to 5, 10 years, how would it?
I'm not an economist, but I will tell you this, that if you would ask anyone, let's take 5-year periods, 1950, 55, 60, 65, 70, if at the beginning of that period you ask somebody, what will Israel look like in the next 5 years? They would got it wrong every time. The amount of growth, if you look around Yerushalayim, the amount of building that's going on everywhere, high-rise buildings that are going up, somebody's pouring money in because somebody thinks there's money to be made here. And that's because people are going to come here. Now, if you had a large scale, when we took in people in the 50s from the Arab countries, it was the same thing. So they came from Arab countries. So when they put them up in tent cities, it wasn't so bad because I remember they interviewed an Ethiopian boy who won a prize in mathematics here. And they asked him, you didn't have anything like this in Ethiopia, did you? He said, in Ethiopia, we didn't have stairs. So, so when you bring people, now you say, your question has a bitter sting to it, right? How are you going to motivate someone from America to come here when what their money can buy is going to be of lesser status than what they had there? Well, if the motivator you're talking about gets too bad, which is that they feel unsafe there, then they'll live with a downgrade in their economic status. It'll be worth it for them. I'm not wishing it on them. But your very question has the answer in it, you know. How can I build myself a palace in Israel? You know what they say? How to make a small fortune in Israel? Come with a big fortune. So I don't know any of the answers to this question. I can tell you when I came and I incurred, because of my family, certain expenses which I had no clue how I was going to pay, and things, Kodesh Baruch Hu worked it out in ways that were totally unanticipated by me. And I'm not the only one who's had that experience. But you have to be willing to come and you have to be willing to make that choice. Anyway, yeah.
So this question's sort of similar to what Kostas had, and it's about like the divinity or like about like text, for example. So I once looked at Safari and I also heard of other texts as well, such as like the Maccabees and like stories for Hanukkah, as well as like the history of Jews during the Roman Empire, and up to like the destruction, say, like in Beis Hamikdash, and other texts such as like Psalms 151 and 154 and those other texts. Why did they make it into the Tanakh? Why did the Tanakh go from the beginning of the creation world and ends when the second Beis Hamikdash was built during the Persian Empire and the story of Purim?
Well, I'll tell you, the Gemara reports that it was tricky. There were certain books, even the ones that were accepted in the end, about which there were great debates. The book of Yechezkel, because he has in it laws which, although his laws that he's predicting are laws for the third temple, which hasn't been built yet, but they don't follow some of the laws that we have in terms of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, that of Solomon. Ecclesiastes, because of its surface pessimism and contradictions that are in it, and they had to decide whether these are expressions of genuine divine inspiration or not. Now, I must tell you, the group of people who were making these decisions had among them the last prophets. So it wasn't just as if they were scholars from Cambridge, figuring it out on the basis of the number of olives on the page. I had people who understood the spirituality that would be genuine to arise from a book. What their discussions are, as far as I know, were not recorded, and it was very difficult to. It said someone's lit lamps at night after night, going through all the verses in Yechezkel to be able to figure out how they could be understood in such a way that you wouldn't see contradictions to what we otherwise would know to be true. So this evaluation was made by the men of the Great Assembly at the beginning of the Second Temple period, and then after that, I don't think we had competent judges of what would be divinely inspired or divinely dictated in that way. We are also told by the very same tradition that prophecy ended. Now, prophecy is one thing, divine inspiration is another thing. And I think a great majority of the sources agree that was what the third section of the Tanakh, which we call the writings, not a result of prophecy. So it didn't have to be prophecy to get into the Holy Scriptures. But nothing else, no writing, no written account after that had that status. So each one of them is taken as a human product and is judged on its own basis. For example, Josephus is quoted with respect by our scholars. Not because it had any divinity, but because those who studied it and knew our traditions felt that he was generally reliable. And there are things in Josephus which all the other historians laughed at and turned out to be true. For example, he writes that there was a war against the Romans in which an entire Roman battalion was wiped out to the last man. And Roman historians and other ones poo-pooed it and said it only happened once, I think in Gaul, but then they found the archaeological evidence for it. Turns out it happened twice. So when he turned out to be right about that, people said, well, something more to be taken seriously there. And they do quote him. The Gemara quotes Ben Sira, but not always with acceptance. So that they reserved that independence. The Book of Maccabees, as far as I know in our sources, is very little quoted to say what the real story of the Maccabean revolt is. I haven't studied these things, so I really don't know. I'm just saying that that was the process by which it was done. Okay, let me finish by telling you something which we're saying the 27th Psalm. And there's a few words there which carry, I think, a very profound message. In Hebrew, it's L'cha Omar Libi Bakshu Fonai. Now, if you look up those words in the dictionary, it comes out like this. L'cha means to you. Omar Libi, my heart said. To you, my heart said. Bakshu Fonai, seek out my face in the plural. Bakshu is plural. All of you seek out my face. So let's try to figure this out. To you, my heart said. Who's speaking to whom? Is it we speaking to God? Then we go on to say, all of you, God and the angels, Bakshu Fanai, seek out my face. Richard? That's an odd communication. But then, is he speaking to us? And Hashem is saying, to you, my heart said? We don't have anything like that in the totality of Scripture, where God says, I'm saying from my heart. That's a human description. It's not a divine description at all. So I looked this up once because it bothered me. And I saw Rashi, his commentary on that psalm, says the following. Lecha means on your behalf, for your sake. And it's a person speaking to God. Listen, Creator, my heart is speaking on your behalf. My heart is communicating to me your message. And here's what my heart tells you in your name. My heart tells me that you're saying, Bakshu Fanai, seek out my face. And you're saying it in the plural. You're saying it to all of us, not just to me personally, individually, but you're saying it to all of us. Now, that's a very beautiful idea, but I think it has to be seen in the context of other verses. In the Shema, the third paragraph, which is really an extra paragraph, we say, don't evaluate, that's what lasur means there, don't evaluate, it's spelled with a sof, not a samach. Don't evaluate, see the malbim in that parsha. Don't evaluate according to your heart. Don't trust your heart. Don't rely on your heart. Your heart is prejudiced, your heart is short-sighted, your heart rationalizes. You want to know what to do? Seek out objective wisdom from those who know. So if I'm given a general caution, don't follow the vice of my heart, how then can King David qualify and say, my heart is giving me God's message? If my heart is giving me God's message, then that means that sometimes I can trust my heart. I think that's part of the reason why we say this psalm, the 27th psalm, for the whole of Elul and for almost all of Tishrei till the end of Sukkot. Because yes, in January and in May and in August, the heart might lead you astray. It could be almost, I would say, consistently leading you astray. When you come to Elul and you're preparing for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and then you go through Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and you come to Sukkot, you go through Sukkot, there's so much inspiration, there's so much divine influence, there's so much consciousness of the divine, that then, under those conditions, you can trust your heart. Because your heart will, in fact, be communicating God's message. So this would be an exception to what those other verses say. And the essential message is Bakshu Panai, seek out my face. The Gemara says that every day a voice from Sinai proclaims, so to speak, the pain of the Creator all the way to the Father whose children are not at his table, and all the way to the children who are not at their Father's table. Because Baruch Hu wants closeness with us. He wants connection with us. According to many, the whole purpose of our creation is to achieve dveikus, which means attachment and connection to Him. So when we get a message, Bakshu Panai, that's certainly true. And that's the underlying theme of all of the performances of Elul and of Tishrei. Seek out a connection with the Kodesh Baruch Hu, what they call in certain circles God consciousness, which sounds very august. It should sound august. We don't mean exactly what they mean, but all right, God consciousness, mental focus, emotional focus, and feeling that you're walking together through life with a Kodesh Baruch Hu. There's a wonderful mashal parable. I don't think it has a Jewish source, but I believe it has a beautiful, correct message. It comes to the end of a man's life, and he's looking back over his life, and he sees his path, and he sees two sets of footsteps. His footsteps and God's footsteps. He's saying to God, look, I see. You were with me, you accompanied me, except for a few times. The times when I was in most distress, the times when I was in most pressure, most difficult for me, I see only one pair of footsteps. Why did you abandon me when I needed you most? And the answer is, my son, look again. Those are my footsteps. I was carrying you. Oh, one set of footsteps. Whose footsteps are they? That's the spirit, I think, which you have to think in terms of going through life with God. So in January, sometimes it's hard to keep that in focus. But in Elul and Tishrei, it's much easier to put it in focus. And that's what the words in the 27th Psalm are saying. Yeah.
What if after times of great inspiration, one doesn't work as hard?
I'm sorry, I'm not getting it. Try it again.
One after a time of great inspiration, such as after Sukkot, doesn't listen to his heart. He goes against it.
Well, we are affected by our environment. All our sages teach us this, Maimonides in particular. So when you have the environment of extra commandments and extra periods of time of holidays, and you have extra performances, they support a special consciousness. But when you go through time where you don't have that, then you're not as inspired. So you're not going to be as conscious.
After, let's say, an environment like Sukkot with Yeshiva, it's super inspiring and everything, and your heart's telling you gotta do X, Y, and Z, I don't know, tefillah with a million, or Shabbos in a hotel in Norway, you don't listen to it.
Well,
You just go business.
look, you're asking a question that touches on many different areas. But let me give you an example which people should meditate about. You've heard of the book of Jonah. What happened to Jonah? He's a prophet. And the Creator says to him, go to Nineveh and transmit my message. And right after the prophecy ends, he gets on a ship to Tarshish going in the wrong direction. How could he do that? That's more than our Yom Kippur. That's more than our Sukkot. Because Baruch Hu gives us free will. And sometimes what that means is, no matter how much inspiration you have, there's a counterbalancing temptation which retains your free will. Now it varies. During prophecy, he wouldn't have free will. During prophecy, he wouldn't have free will. But the minute the prophecy stops, he's restored to a condition where he has free will and he can rebel. So you could, if you like, look at Elul and Tishrei as like our being in a condition that's similar in a miniature way to prophecy and having that tremendous effect on ourselves. And that gives us much more support for making the right decisions. But when that support no longer is there, and it becomes November and December and January and February and March, it wears off. I think that's typical for people. Okay, tomorrow we'll start a new subject.